Okay, so today is January 10th, 2026. And for the last 2 weeks, we've been watching something unfold in Iran that it just feels less like another political protest and more like a tectonic plate shifting under our feet.
It's a fundamental change. I mean, for 14 consecutive days now, the country has been gripped by what is easily its most geographically widespread uprising in decades.
And when you say widespread, you're not exaggerating. This isn't just localized unrest.
Not at all. We're talking about a fire that has spread across all 31 of Iran's provinces. Our sources are confirming active, sustained confrontations in at least 190 cities. It's everywhere.
So what's driving this? What makes this moment so volatile?
It's what our sources are describing as a perfect storm, a disastrous convergence of crises all hitting at once. You have this profound military humiliation from the war back in June 2025. Then you have an economic collapse that has just finally hit terminal velocity. And layered on top of all that is this fundamental legitimacy crisis that's threatening the very foundation of the 47-year-old Islamic Republic. The pressures have just become too great.
So our mission in this deep dive is to really take you inside that pressure cooker. We want to unpack this confrontation, look at the anatomy of the regime's, frankly, brutal repression.
And we also have to look outside, The role external actors like the U.S. are playing is incredibly delicate, incredibly dangerous.
And maybe the most critical piece of the puzzle is the opposition itself. It's fragmented, it's scattered, but it's hoping to define what a post-regime Iran could even look like.
Which brings us to the core question, the one history is going to answer for us very, very soon. Is this crisis just another protest cycle? Is it something the regime, with all its tools of coercion, will eventually crush and survive?
Or is this it?
Or is this, finally, the beginning of the end, that irreversible shift? And you have to remember, the stakes couldn't be higher, not just for the 85 million people living there, but for the entire region.
Before we get into the protests themselves, let's start where this fire was really lit, the economy. Because the numbers, they just scream desperation.
They're astronomical.
What started as this cry over the price of bread has mutated into this explicit challenge to the entire system's right to exist. Just listen to this one statistic. The Iranian rial. It's now over 1.4 million to a single U.S. dollar.
It's hard to even wrap your head around a number like that. 1.4 million. It's not just a drop. It's a complete wipeout of value. It destroys savings, salaries, pensions, everything instantly.
And the official inflation rate is what, over 40%?
Over 40, and our sources are very clear that number is dramatically understated. The real cost of food, of medicine, of just keeping a roof over your head it's unofficially much, much higher.
So when you say 1.4 million rials to the dollar, what does that actually mean for an Iranian family trying to buy groceries?
It means the entire monetary system has failed. It's lost its basic function as a store of value. People are literally trying to exchange piles of useless cash for anything tangible, a little bit of gold, maybe some property if they can. It creates this feedback loop of sheer panic.
So your salary becomes just a symbolic number.
Exactly. It's completely detached from the actual cost of feeding your family. And when that happens, the state has fundamentally broken its most basic social contract, providing a baseline of economic security. That failure is the structural weakness that allowed this whole political crisis to just ignite.
Okay, let's unpack that genesis. It's fascinating how often these huge revolutionary moments start with something so mundane, the daily struggle. This whole thing didn't start with a big political speech.
No, not at all. It began with financial panic. The immediate trigger, back in late December 2025, was a series of localized strikes in Tehran's Grand Bazaar.
And that specific location, the bazaar, is so significant, isn't it?
Oh, it's everything. The Grand Bazaar is not just a marketplace. It is the historical, economic, and frankly, the political heart of conservative Iran. When the merchant class, the bazaarists, when they move, it signals profound, profound trouble for the regime.
So their initial strikes weren't even a political uprising.
Not initially. It was a desperate alarm bell. It was the economic foundation of the country saying the economy is completely non-functional, fix the currency crisis before our businesses, and the entire country collapse.
And as you said, this collapse didn't happen in a vacuum. Years of sanctions, pressure were already squeezing the economy. But what was the decisive factor? What pushed it from fragile into freefall?
The sanctions were the long, slow burn. The decisive factor, the accelerant, was the military humiliation suffered during that short, brutal 12-day war with Israel and the United States in June 2025.
The government tried to frame that as resistance, right?
Of course, that's the standard narrative. But the reality on the ground was catastrophic. This war didn't just rattle some nerves, it severely damaged Iran's critical nuclear infrastructure. These were assets the regime had poured immense wealth and national prestige into protecting for decades.
And the psychological effect of that defeat must have been just devastating. This is a regime that trades so heavily on its image of regional power and invincibility.
Absolutely. The regime prides itself on strategic depth, on its ability to dictate terms across the Middle East. So when its core strategic assets are neutralized in less than 2 weeks, that aura of invincibility is just instantly shattered.
And then they push the cost onto the people.
And that's the killer. The government's response is to force the cost of that humiliation, scarcity, deeper shortages, currency devaluation onto the ordinary population. The contract is broken. If the regime can't even achieve victory or protect its own crown jewels, and then it makes its own people pay for that failure, what exactly is it offering? Nothing but suffering.
So you have the economic pain colliding with this deep political humiliation. And the crucial alarm bell, as our sources highlight, was the closure of those bazaars on December 28th. Why is that specific action so terrifying for the ruling establishment?
It's a signal that goes back centuries, but most critically, it echoes the 1979 revolution. The bazaar is the nerve center of traditional, often religious capital in Iran.
Right.
And in 1979, the coalition between the clergy and the bazaris was absolutely essential in bringing down the Shah. So when the bazaars close in protest today, the ruling structure knows that its conservative, stability-focused bedrock, the very groups they usually rely on for support, or at least for neutrality, has been fundamentally alienated.
It's an internal declaration of no confidence.
It's a financial declaration that the state has lost control of the economy and, by extension, its mandate to rule. That's why the regime treats it as an existential threat. They know exactly what it means historically.
And then within days, you see this incredible mutation. The economic complaints just explode into full-blown political rebellion. The speed of it is just astonishing.
It shows how much anger was just sitting right below the surface, waiting for a spark. And we saw massive escalations across several crucial sectors of society, which tells you this was a widespread societal fracture, not just a labor dispute.
What were the key signs?
First, the truck drivers. They halted deliveries nationwide. That cripples the physical economy, disrupts supply chains. Then the universities, always a flashpoint, just poured into the streets, injecting this organized intellectual energy into the movement.
And of course, the most symbolic and visible sign of all, the women's movement re-emerging right at the forefront.
Exactly. Women openly defying the compulsory hijab laws, using this crisis as a lever to challenge the regime's core ideological pillar. They resurrected that iconic chant, "Woman, Life, Freedom," the rallying cry from the 2022 Masa Mini protests.
And that signaled that the demands were no longer negotiable.
No. This was fundamentally about freedom, about bodily autonomy. The grievances had shifted completely from fix the Ryle to dismantle the theocracy.
You can see it right there in the chants themselves. They moved from complaining about prices to these direct challenges to power. Chance of death to Khamenei, which is a capital offense.
A guaranteed death sentence if you're caught and convicted.
And then the chant that surprised so many international observers, "Long live the Shah," echoing in cities that were supposed to be regime strongholds. What is that about?
That chant is deeply fascinating, and I think if you really connect it to the bigger picture, it's not necessarily a literal demand for a return to a monarchist system, especially not from younger protesters who never even lived under the Pahlavis.
So what did it function as?
It functions as a symbolic rejection of the entire identity of the current system. It's a demand for a different kind of national coherence, a state that is secular, that is nationalist, and functional. All traits the Islamic Republic has spectacularly failed to sustain.
So it's nostalgia for order.
It's nostalgia for order, for national dignity, for a non-clerical identity, and it's being weaponized against the current disorder and humiliation. It's basically shorthand for a national pride that's divorced from ideological shialism.
So it's less about the specific historical figure of Reza Pahlavi and more about just rejecting the entire 47-year experiment of the Islamic Republic itself.
Precisely. It's reaching back into that deep 7,000-year history for a symbol of continuity and secular statehood that offers a clear, powerful alternative to the theocracy. And the power of that symbol is immense because it connects the suffering of today to a wider pre-1979 national story.
And from there, the movement moved quickly past civil disobedience. Our sources describe it as crossing a psychological Rubicon into outright confrontation. What did that look like on the ground?
Well, the target shifted. It went from symbolic protests to direct attacks on state assets. In cities like Lordigan and Marvdash, we saw demonstrators actively torching police vehicles, attacking government buildings, and crucially, destroying statues of the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
Those aren't just acts of vandalism, are they?
No, no. They are acts of political and religious desecration. When you tear down the image of the supreme leader in public, you are demonstrating to everyone that the population no longer fears the symbols of his authority, that public defiance is absolutely essential for radicalizing the movement and attracting more people who are on the fence.
And you could see the preparation on the opposition side escalating to match. Opposition channels started circulating these DIY guides for everything from basic defense tactics to making makeshift weapons.
That's the signal that the street intends to fight back. I mean, when an unarmed populace starts circulating guides for Molotov cocktails or how to build improvised shields, it means they no longer believe they can achieve their goals through just showing up and chanting. They're preparing for sustained violent defense.
While all this was happening internally, you had the exiled voice of Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi adding fuel to the fire. He made a very visible call for mass action on January 8th and 9th, urging Iranians to seize control of their cities.
Which coincided with the regime's predictable but also highly detrimental move, a near-total nationwide internet shutdown.
And when you say near total, what are we talking about?
We're talking about connectivity being reduced to roughly 1% of normal levels. This is a sophisticated and highly effective mechanism. It's designed to do two things. First, kill coordination among protesters, isolate local cells from each other, and second, create a digital fog of war, concealing the inevitable atrocities from the outside world. The regime understands that communication is the lifeblood of any modern decentralized movement.
The endurance of the protests under that level of suppression is just almost unbelievable. How did they manage to keep the momentum going with only 1% connectivity?
The momentum was fueled by raw, accumulated rage. It made a local decentralized action possible without needing a central digital command. The sheer geographic spread became its own form of resilience.
So one city's protests would inspire another, even without direct communication?
Exactly, and the sources point this out. On January 8th alone, the Institute for the Study of War recorded more than 156 separate protest incidents across 27 provinces. These often involved crowds of over 100 people. The protests endured because the anger was so universal, it transcended the need for Twitter or Telegram. Local knowledge and just word of mouth. That became the network. The regime can shut down the internet, but they can't shut down memory or shared humiliation.
That widespread endurance. That might be the most defining feature of this whole uprising so far. Okay, so given the scale of this, the explicit challenges to power, we have to look at the other side of the coin. The machine of the state's counter-response. It was swift, it was structured, and it was brutal.
This is the deployment of the Iron Fist. The state mobilized its core instruments of internal coercion in layers. The immediate response, of course, came from the riot police and the Basij paramilitary.
The shock troops.
The shock troops, the eyes and ears of the regime, largely composed of ideological volunteers. But in a clear signal of escalation, the state also deployed IRGC ground forces in key regions. The involvement of the IRGC's regular army means the regime perceives this threat as completely existential. This is way beyond mere crowd control now.
And they concentrated this power strategically, didn't they? Particularly in the Kurdish-populated provinces like Kermanshah and Kurdistan. Why that specific focus? Why not just crush Tehran first?
That focus reveals the regime's deepest, most primal fear: fragmentation. Tehran fears separatism just as much as revolution, maybe even more. The Kurdish areas, along with Baluchistan and Khuzestan, have long histories of marginalization and autonomy demands.
And they were a major flashpoint in 2022 after Mahsa Amini's death.
A huge flashpoint. So the regime's calculation is that if they can violently contain the periphery, if they can make sure no ethnic region breaks away or achieves autonomy, then they can isolate and preserve the Persian center. The fear is that if the Kurds succeed, the Azeris and the Balakh will be next.
The methods of violence, the details from human rights organizations are just horrifying.
The repression has been expensive. Security forces have used tear gas, batons, metal pellets, and, in numerous documented cases, live ammunition fired directly into crowds. The human toll is rising daily. According to the human rights activist news agency, HRNA, we know of at least 65 people killed in these 2 weeks. And we have to be clear, that number includes children.
And the arrests.
Over 2,300 people arrested in these huge dragnet operations across the country.
But the sources also noted something important. This is not a one-sided slaughter. There are casualties on the regime side, which speaks to the intensity of these clashes.
That's a critical detail that's often overlooked. Regime sources themselves have acknowledged at least 14 security personnel deaths. When an uprising results in double-digit security force casualties in less than 2 weeks, you know the protest is not passive.
It suggests a much higher level of confrontation.
It suggests organized, sometimes even armed, resistance from the populace. At the very least, a level of violent confrontation that is significantly higher than in previous protest cycles. The security forces are taking losses, and that complicates their morale, their cohesion, and their willingness to just blindly obey orders indefinitely.
We mentioned the internet blackout, the digital fog of war. What have international human rights groups been able to document happening under that cloak of digital silence?
The blackout has been used to conceal systemic atrocities. Both Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have confirmed unlawful killings in at least 13 cities across 8 provinces. But the terror tactics go far beyond the deaths on the street.
What do you mean?
There are severe documented allegations of systematic human rights abuses designed to punish and humiliate the population. We're talking about reports of gang rapes, mock executions, and the deeply cynical tactic of raiding hospitals.
Raiding hospitals to detain the wounded. That is pure, calculated terror. It turns the one safe space, a place of healing, into an extension of the prison system.
It creates a situation where the wounded are terrified to seek medical attention. They're forced to hide their injuries or rely on clandestine care, which often leads to avoidable deaths or permanent disability. It's designed to break the movement psychologically by punishing compassion itself.
And on top of that physical violence, there's the judicial terror.
Yes. The judiciary quickly resurrected its most feared legal tool, threatening protesters with capital charges like enmity against God or muharebe.
And that term, enmity against God, it isn't a legal charge in the way we'd understand it, is it? It's an ideological death sentence.
That's exactly what it is. It's a tool of state terror designed to justify summary executions and instill absolute fear into anyone even contemplating dissent. It's a chilling reminder that this regime operates not from a secular legal code, but from a rigid theological default setting.
And this brings us to a really crucial point. We can't analyze this crisis in Iran the way we would in, say, Egypt or Chile. This theological mindset of the clerical elite. Why does it mean their endgame is so fundamentally different?
This is the most important distinction to grasp. Iran's rulers, especially that core clerical elite, do not see themselves as politicians who are just clinging to a job or guarding a political constitution. They view themselves as the executors of Allah's will. They are custodians of a sacred state, the velayat-i faqih. Their power, in their own minds, isn't derived from a contract with the people. It's metaphysical. It comes from the divine.
So if their power is divinely ordained,
Yeah.
how do they perceive popular dissent? It's not just a political disagreement.
It's not. It means that compromise is not seen as political prudence or a strategy for long-term stability. It is viewed as apostasy. It's a profound moral weakness. Dissent, in their view, isn't the legitimate political alternative. It is a moral disease, a sickness spread by foreign enemies.
So protesters aren't citizens with grievances.
No, they're categorized as sinners, agents of chaos, or tools of foreign enemies. This ideological scaffolding allows them to justify any level of repression, because when your power is sacralized, the act of repression becomes a necessary religious ritual to cleanse the system. You're saving the soul of the state, not just saving your job.
And the supreme leader, Khamenei, at 86 years old, has reinforced this rigid, uncompromising line his entire career.
Absolutely. He has consistently drawn this hard, unyielding line between what he calls legitimate economic complaints, which he might grudgingly admit exist, and what he calls sabotage or political unrest. He's dismissed the core protesters as foreign agents acting to please President Trump. His signal to the security forces and the people is unwavering. There will be no concessions, no political dialogue, only submission or punishment.
Which means this inherent theological rigidity eliminates any possibility of a soft landing.
None whatsoever. Khamenei's self-conception and the ideology of the Islamic Republic dictates that stepping aside or negotiating the system away is simply not an option. He is not calculating a comfortable retirement like Pinochet or weighing exile like Mubarak. To resign would be to deny the entire divine purpose of the system he embodies.
So his endgame is strictly binary.
Completely. It's either survival through overwhelming force or collapse through total fracture. There is no middle path. There's no managed transition or negotiated exit strategy built into the system's DNA.
And to make it all even more complicated, Iran isn't some simple centralized autocracy run by one old man. It's this institutional labyrinth, which makes the idea of its collapse a much, much messier prospect.
That institutional resilience is the key structural factor that has prevented a quick collapse in the past. Iran is a vast country of more than 85 million people, and it's governed by this extraordinarily dense, layered web of interconnected institutions that go far beyond the supreme leader's office. It's a parallel state.
Let's detail some of the key parts of that ecosystem. It's more than just the regular army, right?
Oh, far more. You have the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is a parallel military, a parallel political force, and a parallel economic empire. It has its own ground, air, and naval forces, its own intelligence service, and its own massive construction and engineering firm, Atam al-Anbiya,
And then you have the Basi militia.
which is this massive social control network deeply integrated into neighborhoods, schools, and mosques. They are the ideological foot soldiers on the ground.
So those are the military and paramilitary arms. What about the economic and judicial wings of this maze?
Just as critical, you have parallel intelligence services and clerical courts that operate with a degree of autonomy from the regular government. But maybe the greatest source of resilience is economic. These powerful ideological foundations, called bonyads, and the state-owned conglomerates they control.
And these bonyads are huge,
Yeah.
right?
They control vast, non-taxable wealth and provide patronage and jobs to hundreds of thousands of people. That makes those people deeply personally vested in the system's survival, regardless of who is president or who is in parliament.
So the challenge isn't just removing the supreme leader or changing a constitution. It's dissolving an entire, entrenched, decades-old apparatus that is simultaneously military, economic, religious, and social.
Precisely, and that's the danger. Removing the apex commune without a detailed, cohesive plan risks the structure not disappearing, but simply fragmenting. And fragmentation in a country as large, diverse, and heavily armed as Iran, that invites profound chaos. It invites localized conflicts and potentially a full-blown civil war, which is the exact worst-case scenario everyone wants to avoid.
Okay, before we move on to the geopolitical calculus and the role of the U.S., I think we need to pause and widen our lens. Because you can't understand Iran's crisis in 2026 by only looking at the last 47 years of the Islamic Republic.
Yeah.
We have to step back to understand the enduring identity that this current regime is failing to embody.
The time horizon is absolutely critical. Iran isn't a new nation-state created in the 20th century. It is an ancient civilization with a deep ingrained memory. When we look at Iran, we're looking at a place where empires rise, languages shift, and religions transform, but a distinct cultural and national core just endures.
So where does that story begin?
The recorded story begins around 7000 BCE. I mean, that's long before the emergence of unified Greece or even the Roman Empire.
So where did this capacity for state building and culture start to take root?
It started with necessity, with advanced agriculture. Early Neolithic communities like Tepes Sialk near Kashan developed advanced irrigation and settled life. This set the stage for the Bronze Age, where the Elamite civilization flourished in the southwest, centered on the magnificent city of Susa. The Elamites had their own writing system, they built massive ziggurats, and they competed militarily with Mesopotamian powers like Sumer and Babylon for centuries. They are the indigenous roots of statehood on the Iranian plateau.
Then came the arrival of the Indo-Iranian tribes, who eventually give Iran its modern name.
Yes. Around 1500 BCE, these tribes migrated onto the Iranian plateau, eventually differentiating into the Medes and the Persians. The Medes were key at first, helping to topple the feared Assyrian Empire in 612 BCE, establishing a political base in what is now northwestern Iran.
But the zenith, the moment Iran became the world's first true superpower, was under the Achaemenids.
The Achaemenid Empire, 550–330 BCE, founded by Cyrus the Great, set the template for imperial rule for millennia. It was the largest empire the world had ever seen, stretching all the way from the Indus Valley to the Mediterranean. And Cyrus established this extraordinary legacy of governance that focused not just on military conquest, but on accommodation.
How did he manage to rule such a vast, diverse territory without relying purely on brute force? I mean, it's an administrative feat that's still studied today.
He implemented a really sophisticated system of decentralized administration. The empire was divided into satrapies or provinces, each governed by a satrap, but they were monitored by imperial spies known as the king's eyes and ears. This dual system ensured both local autonomy and central oversight.
And he famously respected local religions.
Famously. It's codified in the Cyrus Cylinder, often cited as the first declaration of human rights. And he restored the Jews of Babylon to Jerusalem. The empire was held together by an incredible infrastructure, specifically the massive network of royal roads that allowed messages and trade to travel across the entire empire with incredible speed.
And the architecture of that period, like Persepolis, it also spoke to that cosmopolitan power.
Exactly. Sites like Persepolis and Pasargadae weren't purely Persian designs. They incorporated elements from Greek, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Iranian artistic traditions. It was a visual representation of a truly global empire that saw itself as the functional and cultural center of the civilized world.
So after Alexander the Great topples the Achaemenids, we enter the Parthian and then the Sasanian centuries. And this is where Zoroastrianism becomes the defining moral architecture of Iran.
Yes. Zoroastrianism, founded by the prophet Zoroaster probably sometime before the 6th century BCE, was the dominant faith of pre-Islamic Iran and one of the world's earliest codified ethical systems. It introduced this profound moral framework that still resonates today. It framed existence as a continuous, active struggle between Ahura Mazda, the force of truth, order, and light, and Angra Mainyu, the force of deceit, chaos, and darkness.
And you mentioned its global influence, which is a huge point that's often missed.
It's profoundly influential. Many core religious concepts that later became central to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam ideas like ethical free will, where the individual chooses between good and evil, the concept of heaven and hell, the notion of a final judgment, a messianic savior, these were all codified within the Zoroastrian tradition. Religion in ancient Iran wasn't just ritual, it was a complex philosophy of individual and cosmic responsibility.
So moving forward, the Sassanid Empire marked the last great height of pre-Islamic Iran. What was their primary legacy before their fall?
The Sassanids consciously positioned themselves as the glorious heirs to the Achaemenids. They brought back centralized, powerful rule. Under figures like Shapur I, who famously captured a Roman emperor, they created a geopolitical powerhouse. They codified Zoroastrianism as the state religion. But relentless, centuries-long wars with the Byzantine Empire and crippling internal strain gradually exhausted the state completely.
And that exhaustion set the stage for the next great transformation, the Islamic conquest.
It was swift and total. The Sassanid state, internally fractured and militarily spent, couldn't withstand the advance of the highly motivated Arab Muslim armies. Key defeats at Qadisiyah and Nahavan shattered the Persian military. The final king, Yazdegerd III, was assassinated in 651, ending over 4 centuries of continuous imperial rule.
But here's the crucial distinction that defines modern Iran. Conquest, yes, but not Arabization. This is the ultimate example of cultural endurance.
That's the critical insight. Islamization was a gradual process, taking 2 to 3 centuries, often incentivized by the jizya tax on non-Muslims. However, Iran was stubbornly not Arabized. Unlike North Africa or the Levant, the indigenous Persian language survived. It adopted the Arabic script, but it retained its ancient structure and vocabulary. Islamic civilization in Iran absorbed and synthesized Persian ethics, aesthetics, and administrative traditions. In a way, the conquerors were eventually culturally conquered by the depth of Persian civilization.
So Iran adopted the new faith, but ensured its ancient culture survived and actually influenced the very nature of that faith within its borders.
Absolutely. This period is the Islamic Golden Age, and it was powered by Iranian thinkers like Ibn Sina, Avicenna, who revolutionized medicine, and Al-Khwarizmi, whose work gave us algebra and algorithms. And the poet Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, was this defiant act of cultural preservation. Written in near-pure Persian, it preserved the pre-Islamic epic memory, proving that Persian humanity and Islam could coexist.
And we jump forward now to the moment that permanently defined modern Iran's religious and political identity, the Safavid turning point.
The Safavid dynasty, starting in 1501, unified Iran, and through a deliberate act of statecraft, declared Twelver Shia Islam the mandatory state religion. This was a monumental, history-altering decision. It structurally differentiated Iran from its vast Sunni neighbors, the Ottomans and the Mughals, and it created the religious identity that underpins the ideological state structure we see today. The Vilayat-e-Faqih system is a direct descendant of that Safavid centralization of religious and political authority.
And this deep history finally connects directly to the seeds of the 2026 crisis, bringing us into the modern ruptures of the 20th century.
Exactly. The Pahlavi reforms under Reza Shah and Mohammad Reza Shah tried to enforce rapid secularization and modernization, like the White Revolution in the 1960s. This created a westernized modern elite, but it also caused deep resentment. It alienated the traditional clerical establishment and the powerful, conservative, bazaar classes, the very groups that had been the foundation of social stability for centuries.
And that alienation created the perfect coalition, clergy, students, bazaris, for the 1979 revolution led by Ayatollah Khomeini, which founded the Islamic Republic, the very hybrid theocracy that is now experiencing the most fundamental strain of its existence.
And if we connect this all back to the protests today, the chanting of "Long live the Shah" isn't a simple demand for the return of an autocratic king. It's a desperate cry for that historical coherence and national identity, that deep, secular, Iranian sense of self that the current regime has entirely failed to sustain. It's a rejection of the theocratic framework in favor of a secular, nationalist continuity that respects Iran's entire 7,000-year history, not just the last 47 years.
That context just profoundly changes how we interpret this uprising. They are searching for a state that respects the entire sweep of their history. Now we have to shift our focus from the internal furnace to the external pressure cooker. The sources extensively detail the role of the United States, specifically President Trump's rhetoric, and the massively complicated impact it's having on the streets of Iran.
The Trump factor introduces an immediate and massive variable into this. On January 9th, President Trump issued these stark warnings, stating that the U.S. would hit them very hard if the regime escalated violence. But crucially, he coupled this with an insistence that there would be no American boots on the ground.
That's a deliberately high-stakes, almost contradictory threat. It's designed to be loud, but also limited. How does that kind of rhetoric actually land?
It has a precise dual impact. On one hand, it's a massive morale boost for demonstrators, and it's amplified by the recent, very visible Washington-led capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, a major win for American foreign policy that makes their threats feel more credible. Protesters feel seen, they feel protected by a perceived international red line. It's leverage for them.
But the downside is immediate and severe. It's a perfect propaganda gift for the regime.
It hands Tehran the immediate, pre-packaged ability to frame the entire uprising not as a legitimate internal struggle, but as a foreign-engineered plot aimed at pleasing President Trump. This is the authoritarian playbook 101. Turn legitimate dissent into treason. It allows the regime to activate nationalist sentiment that might otherwise be directed against them.
You characterized Trump's warnings as primarily deterrence, a red line meant to restrain a mass slaughter. Let's analyze the strategic thinking there.
The strategy is to establish a credible external restraint that's designed to influence the internal calculations of the security leadership. The message is aimed squarely at the IRGC commanders. If you cross a certain threshold, if you enact a mass slaughter campaign like we saw in Syria, the consequences will be military, not just another round of condemnation.
So it's a threat meant to save lives, not to start a war.
Exactly. The calculation is that allowing unchecked massive brutality would be a moral failure, and it would also globally embolden other authoritarians.
But this debate leads us directly to the question of direct force, what the sources call the perils of the hammer. Why is a full-scale invasion, boots on the ground, seen as not just implausible, but strategically catastrophic?
Because Iran is not Iraq in 2003. It's not Libya in 2011. It's a deeply complex, geographically massive country with a long, powerful history of statehood. It has a highly motivated, entrenched security structure, and crucially, its population is driven by a deep historical nationalist consciousness.
So any military action, no matter how precise, guarantees a devastating blowback.
Total blowback. Any ground intervention would instantly and completely delegitimize the domestic opposition. It would force millions of Iranians who despise the regime to rally behind it as the necessary defender of the homeland against foreign aggression. It turns a popular uprising into a nationalist resistance movement, and it risks immediate regional escalation across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and the Gulf.
What about the lesser hammer-targeted U.S. airstrikes against IRGC or besieged facilities? And that the U.S. certainly has the capability.
Airstrikes are feasible, but they are fraught with strategic risk. Their primary danger is that they could resurrect the regime's nationalist narrative. Every missile strike gives the theocracy a potent external enemy to fight, potentially extending its lifespan. They could change the conversation from economic collapse to national defense. And they invite immediate retaliation against U.S. forces, Israel, or Gulf partners.
So the consensus is that military strikes are best viewed purely as reactive contingencies in response to mass atrocities, not as proactive tools for regime change. The hammer is just too crude for this situation.
Precisely. The smarter approach, the one most analysts and opposition leaders favor, is the wisdom of the vice, a layered, multifaceted pressure campaign designed to accelerate internal collapse without ever becoming the unifying enemy. It's a strategy of exploiting existing fractures rather than creating new ones.
Let's drill down on the three main components of this pressure campaign. Starting with economic strangulation. I mean, how do you intensify sanctions when the economy is already at 1.4 million reals to the dollar?
The goal shifts from merely imposing sanctions to ruthless, targeted enforcement. This means intensifying pressure on the regime's illicit funding sources and the financial networks of the IRGC. Specific actions include seizing sanction-violating oil tankers, freezing the assets of elite officials in Europe and Asia, and methodically targeting the regime's shadow banking networks in places like Turkey and the UAE.
So you cut off the money that pays for the repression.
You cut off the illicit funds that IRGC commanders use to enrich themselves and pay their forces. This accelerates elite defections because the system can no longer afford to pay or protect its own.
The second component is empowering the protesters, but doing so indirectly, without owning them. This seems like the most delicate part.
It is. The support must be precise, limited, and focused on tools that bypass the regime's control mechanisms. The most critical tool right now is denying the blackout, providing satellite internet access, specifically Starlink terminals, to bypass that 1% connectivity limitation. This restores their digital nervous system. It allows for coordination, documentation, and communication with the outside world.
And messaging.
Messaging is key. Continuous, high-quality Farsi language broadcasting that exposes regime atrocities, highlights IRGC corruption, and crucially, offers covert encouragement of security force defections through conditional amnesty messaging. You give them the tools to execute the change themselves.
And finally, the third tool in the vice, cyber warfare. The non-kinetic approach.
Right. Targeted cyber operations against IRGC command and control systems or bossy surveillance infrastructure are highly deniable and psychologically destabilizing. Modern repression runs on servers and digital databases. Disrupting that centralized command capacity can blind the security forces without firing a single missile. In authoritarian systems, nothing spreads paranoia faster than the suspicion that the center cannot see or control the periphery.
It's a strategy of surgical leverage, using the smallest force to achieve the largest possible structural effect on the regime's cohesion. We've established the regime is brittle, the external pressure is rising. But if the Islamic Republic falters, the question immediately becomes, who fills the vacuum? Who is ready to govern, and who has the legitimacy to hold a country of 85 million people together? This is the fundamental opposition paradox.
The paradox is simple. Iran does not lack opposition voices. It has an incredibly broad, passionate, anti-regime ecosystem. What it lacks is a center of gravity, a unified, credible coalition capable of holding the country together during the chaos of a collapse. The opposition is plural, scattered, and deeply fractured by historical rivalries, profound mistrust, and competing visions for the future.
Let's start with the diaspora leaders, who have the most visibility. The central figure emerging from the street chants is Reza Pahlavi, the exiled crown prince. What's his primary strength in this crisis?
His greatest asset is pure structural symbolism. He evokes a pre-revolutionary era associated, whether accurately or not, with state functionality, national dignity, and secular governance. Protesters hoisting his image are doing so less out of a commitment to monarchy and more out of a desperate search for unity, for continuity, and for a clear, non-theocratic identity.
He also emphasizes territorial integrity, which is a major concern for all Iranian nationalists. Supporters see him as what kind of leader?
They frame him as a potential constitutional monarch or a transitional figure, explicitly not an absolute ruler. His ability to connect with certain patriotic military factions suggests he could offer a palatable exit ramp for security forces looking to switch sides while preserving the state's core institutions.
But the weaknesses are structural and significant.
They are massive. First, he lacks a verifiable, organized political base inside Iran capable of sustained mobilization. Second, his visible engagement with Western and Israeli officials hands tailor-made ammunition to regime propaganda. And finally, attempts at opposition unity often fail because hardline monarchist supporters tend to alienate the Republican, leftist, and ethnic minority groups needed for a broad coalition.
Okay, so Pahlavi has the symbolism, but maybe not the organization. What about Maryam Rajavi and the MEK? They're the opposite, right? All organization. Yeah.
And almost zero internal legitimacy. And that's the core problem. Rajavi leads the People's Mujahideen of Iran, MEK. Their history is incredibly problematic. They began as a Marxist Islamist group opposing the Shah, but their fatal flaw, the one that permanently compromised their domestic standing, came when they aligned and fought alongside Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq War.
The sources are very clear that siding with Iran's enemy during a national war makes them politically toxic for most Iranians.
It created a permanent scar. They are widely viewed inside Iran as traitors. However, we can't ignore their strengths in the context of a transition. The MEK is by far the most organized opposition force Iran has, operating with a military and political discipline no other group can match.
What specifically do they offer?
They think in terms of institutional governance. The NCRI has one of the most detailed blueprints: a provisional government plan, a commitment to secularism, elections within 6 months, their 10-point plan. They have the discipline and readiness to try and fill an institutional vacuum.
But has there been any organic support for them in this uprising?
Absolutely not. They are widely seen as cult-like and authoritarian. Crucially, the protests have shown no organic slogans in support of the MEK and sometimes explicit rejection. You cannot rule without social trust, and the MEK has a profound deficit there.
Then you have Masih Alinejad, who possesses massive global visibility and moral authority.
Alinejad is the conscience of the movement. She embodies the moral dimension, especially for women, through her My Stealthy Freedom campaign. She is an indispensable advocate who keeps the global spotlight on Iran's abuses.
But is she a political contender?
She's an advocate, not an executive. She lacks the political machinery or a governing coalition capable of running ministries and securing borders. Her strength is moral and inspirational, which is vital, but insufficient for leading a state transition.
Which leaves us with the internal figures. They have all the credibility earned through suffering, but they're physically immobilized.
Figures like Narges Mohammadi, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate. She's the undisputed moral face of the woman, life, freedom movement. Her courage commands immense domestic respect, but she's in prison. She represents legitimacy, not logistics. Similarly, Mostafa Tazadeh, a former reformer turned political prisoner, has valuable institutional experience, but he's also incarcerated and carries the baggage of the failed reformist movement.
So the overall challenge is stark. Internal figures have credibility but no mobility. External figures have visibility but limited legitimacy. How does the vast diaspora of over 8 million Iranians fit into solving this?
The diaspora is an absolutely vital reservoir of technical, financial, and governance expertise. They are essential for funding a transition, providing the financial networks, diplomatic backing, and technical aid needed to stabilize a new government. They can help bridge the internal divides by acting as nonpartisan enablers, provided they understand their role is to facilitate, not direct, the process.
The status quo is dead. The sources are clear on that. Even if the regime survives this specific moment, it cannot rule as it did before. The damage to its legitimacy is just irreversible. So let's look forward. What are the 4 looming scenarios for the next phase?
The most immediate, and sadly the most likely in the short term, is that repression prevails. History is the regime's grim guide here. They successfully crushed nationwide uprisings in 2019 and 2022 through overwhelming force. With no major verified security defections yet, brute force remains their best bet. But every time they do this, they hollow out their own legitimacy even further.
The second scenario, the internal power shift or the Bonapartist outcome, is maybe the most dangerous threat to a democratic future.
This happens if the system recognizes that Khamenei, at 86, is a strategic liability. He gets sidelined, maybe a medical coup, forced retirement, and replaced by a military strongman, almost certainly from the IRGC. This figure offers limited, calculated reforms like relaxing hijab laws while preserving the core security and economic power of the Guard. It's stability without freedom. It replaces clerical tyranny with military tyranny.
Then you have the low-odds, high-impact scenario, regime collapse.
This is conditional. It requires terminal elite fractures, a major schism between the IRGC and the clergy, or mass organized defections across the security forces. If that happens, collapse becomes conceivable. This could usher in a genuine democratic transition, but it carries an equally high risk of immediate civil war and fragmentation. The odds are low, but they're higher now than they have been in decades.
And the final dark path, proxy escalation.
This is a desperate late-stage bid for survival. Tehran, facing internal defeat, might try to use its foreign militias, Hezbollah, Iraqi proxies domestically to help suppress the uprising. While this might provide temporary security, it would instantaneously and permanently shatter whatever legitimacy the regime has left. Using foreign fighters against your own people would be the ultimate admission of failure.
In any post-regime scenario, a fundamental challenge immediately comes up: Iran's diversity. The crisis will bring the demand for federalism back to the table, especially for the Kurdish population.
The Kurdish question is central to Iran's stability. The Kurdish population, 10 to 12 million people, has suffered systematic marginalization and repression. You have to remember, when the Shah fell in 1979, Khomeini immediately declared jihad against Kurdish autonomy demands. That memory defines their current struggle.
So why is federalism now seen by its proponents as the only way to hold the country together, rather than a threat to its unity?
Because Iran is a mosaic of ethnic groups, Persians, Azeris, Kurds, Balak, Arabs, and others, federalism offers a way to decompress power, to grant regional self-rule over culture, education, and internal security. The model doesn't dissolve national sovereignty. It redistributes power away from the suffocating Persian-centric center. It's about preserving territorial integrity while diffusing deep-seated ethnic grievances.
And proponents often look to a neighboring imperfect success story for a blueprint.
Yes, the model often looks to Iraqi Kurdistan, a constitutionally recognized self-governing federal region. Crucially, the major Iranian Kurdish parties like PDKI and Komala have historically demanded federalism, not secession. Their objective is constitutional recognition and local self-rule within Iran. Dignity without dismemberment.
But the counterargument, the fear of fragmentation, is extremely powerful among centralist Republicans and monarchists.
They argue that federalism is a slippery slope to secession, especially in a chaotic environment. They point to vast economic imbalances. How do you manage wealth distribution between oil-rich Khuzestan and impoverished Baluchistan? And institutionally, Iran lacks any federal tradition, raising fears of bureaucratic collapse and competing chains of command.
And geopolitically, a strong Kurdish autonomous region alarms the neighbors.
That's a major external constraint. Turkey, Iraq, they would be extremely concerned. Any move toward federalism cannot be unilaterally imposed. It must be negotiated with broad national and regional consensus to be sustainable.
Assuming a transition occurs, the sources suggest a plausible transitional architecture that tries to balance legitimacy with stability. What does that framework look like?
It's designed to minimize the vacuum effect. It requires three synergistic elements. First, Reza Pahlavi as a constitutional monarch, a symbolic, unifying head of state without executive power, serving as a historical link. Second, a highly capable interim prime minister, chosen for administrative competence, tasked with stabilizing institutions and restoring basic governance.
And the third element ensures the people decide the final outcome.
Exactly. Elections to a constituent assembly within 1 year, charged with drafting a permanent constitution to decide if the final system is a republic or a monarchy, and critically, how to structurally address the federalism question. It gives a mandate for temporary rule while ensuring the population retains ownership.
That seems pragmatic, but the practical challenge of the interim period is immense, especially regarding the IRGC. You can't just dissolve them overnight.
That is the single greatest challenge. Dismantling the IRGC and Basai without creating a chaotic security vacuum. The transition must learn from the disastrous de-Baathification in Iraq after 2003, which instantly created an armed insurgency. It has to balance justice with stability.
What does that phased approach entail?
It involves a clear carrot-and-stick strategy, offering conditional amnesty for low-level defectors who did not commit war crimes to encourage splits within the forces. Simultaneously, carrying out swift and targeted prosecution of the top officials responsible for mass killing to ensure accountability. This has to be paired with international oversight, maybe via the UN, to demobilize the militias and integrate vetted elements into a new national army.
And finally, the principle of sovereignty must guide all external engagement.
External support, sanctions relief, technical aid, observers must be welcomed only if explicitly invited by the transitional government. Iranians must retain full ownership of the process. If foreign powers are perceived to dictate the change, it risks the long-term instability and backlash we saw in Libya and Iraq. This is the only way to ensure the repression of the past 4 decades is transformed into enduring, domestically owned renewal.
We've covered a massive sweep of information here, tracing this crisis back through centuries. Let's bring it all together. What we're seeing in 2026 is this convergence of unprecedented economic devastation, military humiliation, and a theocratic leadership whose only setting is brutal, non-negotiable repression.
And the critical thing to remember is that institutional resilience. The IRGC, the Basij, the Bonyads, this is a structure designed to endure even if the supreme leader falls. This is why the danger of a Bonapartist outcome, a military strongman replacing the cleric, is so persistent. The security structure will try to preserve itself.
And that strategic vice, the layered pressure campaign, remains the only viable external tool. Starlink access, financial strangulation, cyber operations. These are strategies of leverage, designed to empower the internal movement without creating the nationalist backlash that a military hammer would guarantee.
Avoiding direct military action is paramount. It respects sovereignty and ensures the organic progress of the protests isn't undone by giving the regime a foreign enemy to fight. The U.S. role is to be an enabler, providing the tools for the Iranian people to execute the change themselves.
And finally, that fragmented opposition. Potent symbols like Reza Pahlavi, organization without legitimacy in the MEK, and immense moral authority locked away in figures like Narges Mohammadi. The challenge isn't winning the moral argument, that's already won, but converging on a unifying transitional framework fast enough to prevent chaos.
And that framework has to address the ultimate test of unity, the federalism debate. Can a new Iran be born that respects the rights and autonomy of the Kurdish, Baloch, and Azeri populations while preserving the territorial integrity of the ancient state? Federalism is the only proposal that offers to transform ethnic diversity from a historical fault line into a future foundation, but it requires a level of trust and compromise that just doesn't exist right now.
The silence of submission has been broken across 190 cities and 31 provinces. That cannot be reversed. The country has crossed a psychological Rubicon into outright confrontation.
We're at that classic revolutionary paradox. The moment of greatest possibility is also the moment of greatest risk. The regime is weaker and more brittle than ever, but that makes its death throes inherently more dangerous. History suggests the window for any stable, democratic transition is closing, and closing fast.
We've seen that Iran's civilization, rooted in centuries of cultural resilience, has survived empires and conquerors for millennia by transforming conquest into culture. As a society finally rises in 2026 to demand freedom, the question for you to consider is this. Can a society with such deep historical memory overcome its persistent internal fractures, the centralization of power, the fear of fragmentation, the brutal repression to seize this last, best chance for freedom? Or will the weight of its own past reassert itself in the ultimate painful test of statehood?